This paper has been cooking for a long time. We started collecting data before the pandemic, and then it took us ages to write up. So it's exciting to finally get to this point to be able to present it. Because of the long journey we've been on with this work, it's become something we didn't necessarily anticipate when setting out, and we've had a long time to ruminate on the data. Ultimately, this paper challenged what we thought we knew about the relationship between privacy and trust. While much of the privacy literature touches on trust and vice versa, there's very little that deeply examines the relationship between these two concepts. Prevailing common sense is that it's reasonable to expect that trust reduces privacy concern and therefore promotes information disclosure, and the reverse, that better privacy practices and policies like GDPR will promote trust. This work suggests that the relationship between privacy and trust is actually more complicated and more interesting than has been previously supposed. So let's start with why privacy and trust would appear to have a relationship. For one, the reason privacy matters is because it protects us from various social and political vulnerabilities, and trust is often defined as a willingness to be vulnerable. Secondly, privacy is often framed as a concern, and trust can also be defined as a willingness to give an entity discretionary power in matters of concern to us. So in the paper, we're specifically interested in apparent privacy paradox conditions, where people disclose information in ways that are inconsistent with the high value they claim to place on privacy. And one explanation for this is that people trust the entity in question not to abuse their power. Now, there is in fact empirical evidence that trust moderates privacy concern. This is integral to the well-known privacy calculus model, which proposes that people choose to disclose information in ways that gain them more than they lose. They rationally weigh the perceived usefulness of the service in question against perceived risk, which is moderated negatively by privacy concern and positively by perceived trustworthiness of the service. So studies have shown these effects, but we think there are important reasons to think a bit deeper about what's going on here. For this to be true, people would have to actively consider trustworthiness and privacy concern in their decision-making around information disclosure and consent. Our study shows that neither of these are practical concerns at the moment of consent, at least not according to how people talk about their decision to use these services. For this to be true, it also requires that people's self-reported trust in services they use accurately reflects their trust at the point of making a disclosure or consent decision. Again, our study suggests that trust is subject to revision. Specifically, inflating trust retrospectively helps people make sense of why they've made the choice they've made regarding their information disclosure practices. And lastly, for this to be true, at the most basic level, it requires that people are making a choice to disclose information, and that therefore they're making a choice to trust services with their privacy. Again, what we found is that it's more complicated than this. People may enter into a, quote, trust relationship with a service insofar as they've consented, but we found again and again that this wasn't a choice to disclose. It was choosing to use a service because that service was considered indispensable. So in cases like this, what's the role of trust? What we argue in the paper is that trust is relevant here, but in a radically different way than has been accounted for in existing models. Rather than directly influencing privacy behavior, we show that people manage their accountability for their largely unconscious information disclosure practices by rationalizing that, on some level, they must trust these services. In other words, studies may find a strong correlation between information disclosure and self-reported trust, but this should be understood as being, at least partially, an attempt to morally account for their otherwise paradoxical behavior. Our study was designed to explore whether and how individuals justified their continued use of digital services if they were presented with information that such services' privacy policies conflicted with their own privacy preferences. In stage 1 of the interview, participants were asked to indicate which services they use from a list of popular online services and discuss a bit about their use and attitudes. And this data was entered directly into a Qualtrics survey while we talked. In stage 2, participants were asked to respond to a series of 19 statements that were characteristic of terms they were likely to encounter when signing up for an online service. In fact, we'd adapted these from the privacy policies of the services we included in our list in stage 1. So we asked participants, if you saw these terms for a service, would you agree or disagree to them? And their answers again were entered into the Qualtrics survey. In addition to giving their answer, they explained how they interpreted, or in some cases struggled to interpret their meaning, and how strongly they felt about any of them, including sometimes declaring certain terms to be deal breakers, as in if they saw these in a privacy policy, they would not use that service, they said. Stage 3 was the reveal stage. Participants were shown which services they used in stage 1 clashed with their stated privacy preferences from stage 2, and which terms in particular were in conflict. And then we asked them how they felt about the service and whether this information was likely to influence their use of that service in the future. When designing the study, we were particularly interested in seeing whether older adults were more likely than younger adults to resolve a conflict between their privacy preferences and a service's privacy policies by discontinuing their use of a service. And also whether older and younger adults accounted for their intention to continue using a service in reference to normative expectations for technology use for their age cohort. Now, this built on some prior work on older adults as having greater freedom not to use digital technologies. But instead, we were struck by how similar all participants' accounts were. All participants were unwilling to discontinue using services, despite being shown that it clashed with their privacy preferences, even those that they identified as being absolute deal breakers. Having found this, we reoriented our analysis to dive more deeply into these accounts. We realized that our reveal stage threw participants' digital competence into question in ways that they then had to account for. So given this, we decided it would be most fruitful to adopt an ethno-methodological approach that allowed us to examine participants' practical reasoning about their use of these services and what their responses communicate about how they make moral sense of themselves in the digital world. We found that participants were capable of expressing a variety of compelling reasons to enter into trust relationships with services. None of these reasons seem to be actively weighed against privacy concern, risk, or trustworthiness. In fact, what they were explaining was that examining these things was a pointless exercise. They were going to use these things anyway, and really focusing on these things was just upsetting. It felt better to put them entirely out of mind. So it doesn't appear that privacy calculus actively features in consent at all, and that consenting to the terms of online services falls into the category of what we'd call routinized practice. Secondly, participants weren't even able to articulate privacy concern with respect to typical terms in privacy policies. This finding contradicts the idea that trust in online services is contractual in nature, specifically that mechanisms like privacy policies facilitate contractual trust. So contractual trust requires that the contract makes explicit provisions for contingencies that a person imagines arising. But as we found, participants were unable to confidently explain what harms might arise from agreeing to any of these terms. So given the lack of support for a contractual form of trust at play here, we examined the data to understand the true character of people's trust in online services, and found it to most closely resemble something called hopeful trust. We borrow this concept from a trust philosopher named Victoria McGeer, who writes about a kind of trust that's beyond evidence. In certain situations, she argues, people can be highly motivated to discount all evidence of untrustworthiness and look for any reason to hold on to their trust. They hope that the trust that they have in someone or something is warranted because it not being warranted is too upsetting to a person's worldview to entertain. So remember, our participants have already placed their trust in services by virtue of using them, and having found them indispensable creates a powerful motivation to believe this trust is well placed. McGeer explains that hopeful trust is a pragmatic response to facing the limits of your own agency. So there's only so much that a person can do to bring about the end that they desire. So hope allows a person to ride out their worries and self-doubt by creating this affectively charged scaffolding for being able to do anything at all in an uncertain world. So for our participants, hopeful trust enabled them to engage in the digital world despite the very real limitations they faced in effectuating their privacy preferences. They described an instinct and a real need to act as if they're sure that their privacy will be preserved, while in reality they can admit, if they stop to examine it, that they're not at all sure. But in accounting for their actions, they came up with all sorts of narratives that could justify their hopeful trust. So they'd say things like, well, if it was really that bad, then surely there would be armies of angry customers rising up. These were attempts to make moral sense of their own paradoxical behavior. Asserting reasons to trust these services was an attempt to maintain the appearance of privacy competence in a world in which they were all but guaranteed to fail at self-managing their privacy. The problem with this hopeful trust is that at the individual level, it allows people to use services that may betray their privacy. And at the societal level, it acts as a moral pressure valve for resolving the contradictions of the consent regimes that contribute to the privacy paradox. There has long been a belief that customers will reject untrustworthy systems that violate their privacy, particularly if companies are required to provide information about their privacy policies. So the matter of privacy can simply be left to the market to sort out for us. But this study should raise serious doubts about that logic. The bigger and more useful the service is, the more privacy-violating behavior they can get away with without losing customers. And clearly this also means that use of a service should not be interpreted as an endorsement of its privacy policy. But if we focus on what this hopeful trust is telling us, it could actually shine a light on the inadequacies of the privacy protections we have and the ways they need to improve. So it shows that people are hoping for structural assurances of their privacy that don't yet exist. And crucially, their accounts reaffirm the premise that privacy should promote trust and underscore just how important it is for people to feel that they can trust these services. Ultimately, we argue that although participants can express concerns about privacy when asked about them directly, their accounts show that these concerns are backgrounded in order to be able to use necessary services. Similarly, a person does not actively consider their trust. Trust is taken for granted as a premise of using a service. But when confronted with their own paradoxical behavior, hopeful trust prevents deeper examination of trustworthiness and self-correcting behavior. And in this way, it helps enable the privacy paradox. The only way to unparadox privacy, as it were, is to create conditions for well-placed trust in digital services. And this would mean ensuring that these services respect the high value people place on their privacy, so that trust is grounded not in hope, but in a confident expectation of trustworthiness. Thank you very much.